The blood on her hands would not wash away no matter how hard Grace Keller scrubbed them in the creek outside Ely, Nevada, even though the stains existed only in her mind, and the actual blood had disappeared 3 years ago along with the life she once knew. She knelt by the water in the early morning of June 1878, watching the sun rise over the dusty mining town that had become her refuge, her prison, her purgatory all rolled into one. And she wondered how much longer she could run before Marcus Devlin found her and made good on his promise to see her hang for what she had done to his brother. Grace had been scrubbing laundry for the boarding house for 2 hours already, her fingers pruned and aching when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the creek. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs the way it always did when strangers came near, and she slowly reached for the small pistol she kept hidden in the folds of her skirt. The weapon was old and unreliable, but it gave her some measure of comfort, even if she knew deep down that if Marcus or his men ever caught up to her, one rusty revolver would not be enough to save her life. The rider who emerged from the cottonwood trees was not Marcus Devlin or any of his hired guns. Instead, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds sat astride a paint horse, his dusty clothes and worn leather chaps marking him as a working cowboy rather than a gunslinger. He removed his hat when he saw her, revealing dark hair that touched his collar, and offered her a slight nod of acknowledgement that seemed more courteous than threatening. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice carrying a hint of Texas drawl that made Grace think of wide open spaces and freedom she no longer possessed. "Did not mean to startle you. My horse needs water, if you do not mind sharing the creek." Grace slowly released her grip on the pistol and nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She returned to scrubbing the linens with mechanical efficiency, keeping her head down and her face partially hidden behind the curtain of her honey-blonde hair. Over the past 3 years, she had learned that invisibility was her greatest ally, that drawing attention meant inviting questions, and questions led to discoveries she could not afford. The cowboy dismounted and led his horse to the water's edge, speaking to the animal in low, soothing tones that somehow made Grace feel safer, even though she knew better than to trust feelings anymore. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he knelt downstream from her washing and splashed water on his face and neck, washing away layers of trail dust. There was something solid and genuine about him, something that reminded her of her father before the fever took him and left her alone in a world that had proven far more cruel than she ever imagined. "You work at the boarding house?" he asked after a few moments of companionable silence. "Yes," Grace answered quietly, wringing out a sheet with more force than necessary. "Mrs. Henderson's place on Silver Street. I will be staying there starting tonight," he said, rising to his feet and returning to his horse. "Just signed on with the Double Creek Ranch about 10 miles north of town. Name is Lucas Preston." Grace glanced up at him briefly, meeting those storm-gray eyes for just a moment before looking away. "Grace," she said, offering no last name, no details, nothing that could be traced back to the terrible night in Denver when she had killed a man in self-defense and fled before anyone could call it murder. Lucas Preston seemed to sense her reluctance to share more because he simply nodded and swung back into his saddle. "Well, Miss Grace, I reckon I will see you around town. You take care now." He rode off toward Ely proper, and Grace watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and loneliness. Most men who spoke to her either wanted something she was not willing to give or looked right through her as if she did not exist. Lucas Preston had done neither, and that small kindness made her chest ache with a longing she thought she had buried, along with her old life. Grace finished the laundry and carried the heavy baskets back to the boarding house, her arms burning with the effort. Mrs. Henderson was a fair employer who asked few questions and paid on time, which made her a rare treasure in Grace's experience. The older woman met her at the back door with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression that Grace had come to recognize over the 8 months she had worked there. "You look pale, girl," Mrs. Henderson said, pressing the cup into Grace's hands. "You need to eat more. I will not have you fainting on me during supper service." "I am fine," Grace assured her, though the truth was she often forgot to eat when the nightmares kept her awake and the constant fear made her stomach churn. "A new guest is arriving today, Lucas Preston. He said he hired on at Double Creek." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face brightened considerably. "Lucas Preston? Well, I will be. That boy's father and my late husband used to ride together back in Texas. I have not seen Lucas since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. This will be a fine reunion indeed." Grace felt something twist in her chest, though she could not name the emotion. Jealousy that Mrs. Henderson had history and connections, while Grace had nothing but false names and half-truths? Or perhaps fear that Lucas Preston's arrival would somehow disturb the careful balance she had maintained, the delicate act of existing without truly living. The day passed in the usual rhythm of washing, cooking, serving, and cleaning. Grace moved through her tasks with practiced efficiency, speaking only when spoken to and keeping her eyes downcast. The other women who worked at the boarding house were kind enough, but Grace had never allowed herself to form real friendships. Friendships required honesty, and honesty was a luxury she could not afford. Lucas Preston arrived just before supper, carrying a worn saddlebag and rifle case. Mrs. Henderson greeted him with genuine warmth, pulling him into an embrace that made him laugh and duck his head with boyish embarrassment. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway as the older woman fussed over him, asking about his journey and his plans and his family back in Texas. "My parents passed 2 years back," Lucas said, his voice carrying a quiet grief that Grace recognized in her own heart. "Fever took them both within a week of each other. I have been drifting since then, working ranches across Colorado and Utah. Figured it was time to settle somewhere for a while. And when I heard Double Creek was hiring, I remembered you mentioning this town in your letters to my mother. You are home now," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, patting his cheek with maternal affection. "You will take the room at the end of the hall, the one with the window facing the mountains, and you will eat proper meals and stop this drifting nonsense. A man needs roots, Lucas. Your father would have said the same." Grace slipped back into the kitchen before Lucas could notice her watching, but throughout supper service, she found her eyes drawn to him again and again. He sat at the large communal table with the other boarders, mostly miners and ranch hands, and engaged in easy conversation without the bragging or crude jokes that characterized most of the men who passed through. He had a quick smile and a natural way of making others feel at ease, and Grace realized with a start that she wanted to be near him, to hear that Texas drawl and feel the strange sense of safety his presence evoked. After supper, Grace was scrubbing pots in the kitchen when Lucas appeared in the doorway holding his empty plate. "Mrs. Henderson said I should bring this back to you," he said, then paused as if noticing her properly for the first time in the lamplight. "That was the finest fried chicken I have had in years. Did you make it?" Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, unused to compliments. "Yes, sir, thank you." "No need for sir," he said, moving closer and setting the plate on the counter beside her. "I work for a living same as you. Lucas is just fine." She nodded, acutely aware of how close he stood, of the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. "Lucas, then?" He lingered for a moment, seeming to search for words, and Grace held her breath without knowing why. Finally, he said, "You have a sadness in your eyes that seems too heavy for someone so young. I do not mean to pry, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I am a fair listener." Grace's first instinct was to deflect, to build the walls higher and push him away before he could get close enough to discover her secrets. But something in his genuine concern made her voice softer than intended when she replied, "Some sadnesses cannot be talked away, but I thank you for the kindness." Lucas nodded slowly, accepting her boundary without pushing. "The offer stands whenever you are ready. Good night, Miss Grace." After he left, Grace stood at the sink with her hands submerged in cooling dishwater and let herself cry for the first time in months. She cried for her lost innocence, for the life she could never reclaim, for the connection she could never allow herself to make with a good man like Lucas Preston. Because even if her heart was beginning to crack open toward him, she knew that caring about someone meant endangering them, and she would not bring her darkness into his light. The following weeks fell into a pattern that felt almost like normalcy. Lucas worked long days at Double Creek Ranch and returned each evening for supper, always with a kind word for Grace and an easy smile that made her forget her fear for brief, precious moments. He began helping her carry water from the well, insisting that the buckets were too heavy for her to manage alone. He fixed the broken step at the back door without being asked and replaced the worn hinges on the kitchen window that had stuck since Grace first arrived. Mrs. Henderson noticed, of course, and made comments about what a fine young man Lucas had grown into and how he clearly had taken a shine to Grace. Grace deflected these observations with practiced ease, but internally she felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. She found herself looking forward to the evenings when Lucas would appear in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame and telling her stories about his day, about the ornery cattle and the inexperienced ranch hands and the vast Nevada sky that seemed to stretch into eternity. One evening in late July, after the supper dishes were washed and the other boarders had retired to their rooms or the saloons on Main Street, Lucas asked Grace if she would take a walk with him. Her immediate response was to refuse, to maintain the distance that had kept her safe, but the longing in his eyes matched something deep within her own heart, and she found herself nodding before her rational mind could intervene. They walked through the quiet streets of Ely as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Lucas talked about his childhood in Texas, about learning to rope and ride before he could properly read, about his mother's flower garden and his father's stories of the war. Grace listened, offering little about her own past, but asking questions that kept him talking, because his voice soothed something raw and wounded inside her. "What about you?" Lucas finally asked, as they paused near the edge of town where the desert opened up in all directions. "Where did you grow up? What brought you to Ely?" Grace had prepared answers for these questions, the same lies she had told Mrs. Henderson and anyone else who asked. But standing there in the fading light, with Lucas looking at her with such open honesty, she found the lies sticking in her throat. Instead, she said, "My past is complicated. There are things I cannot talk about, not because I do not trust you, but because speaking them aloud might bring danger I have been running from for 3 years." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than suspicious. "Are you in trouble with the law?" "I do not know," Grace answered, and it was the truth. "I killed a man, but he was trying to hurt me. I ran before I could explain, before anyone could listen. His brother swore he would hunt me down and see me hang, and I have been running ever since." She expected Lucas to step away from her, to look at her with horror or disgust or fear. Instead, he moved closer, reaching out to take her hand in his calloused palm. "Tell me what happened, Grace. All of it." So, there in the Nevada desert with darkness falling around them, Grace told him everything. She told him about working as a seamstress in Denver, about Tyler Devlin, who had courted her with pretty words and promises before revealing his true nature. She described the night he had forced his way into her small room above the dress shop, drunk and violent and intent on taking what she would not freely give. She told Lucas about the struggle, about Tyler's hands around her throat cutting off her air, about grabbing the sewing scissors from her work table and driving them into his neck without thinking, only reacting, only trying to survive. "He died on my floor," Grace whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of the memory. "There was so much blood. I knew no one would believe me, that his family was wealthy and connected while I was nobody. His brother Marcus arrived before the sheriff, and he looked at me with such hatred. He said he would make sure I hang for murdering his brother, that he would hunt me across the earth if necessary. So I ran. I took what little money I had, and I ran, and I have been running ever since." Lucas pulled her into his arms, and Grace collapsed against his chest, sobbing with 3 years of suppressed fear and grief and exhaustion. He held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, and his voice murmuring words of comfort that slowly penetrated the storm of her emotions. "You were defending yourself," he said when her tears finally subsided. "What you did was not murder, Grace. It was survival." "That does not matter if Marcus Devlin finds me," Grace said, pulling back to look up at him. "He has money and influence. He could make the charges stick regardless of the truth. And even if he could not, he might just kill me himself and call it justice." Lucas cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Then, he will have to go through me first. Because I am not going to let anyone hurt you, Grace Keller. Not Marcus Devlin, not anyone." "You barely know me," Grace protested, even as her heart soared at his words. "I know enough," Lucas said firmly. "I know you are kind and hardworking. I know you carry a burden that is breaking you down piece by piece. I know that when you smile, which is far too rare, it lights up everything around you. And I know that I have been falling in love with you since that first morning at the creek, even though I tried to tell myself it was too soon, too fast, too impossible." Grace stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "You cannot love me. My past will catch up eventually. It always does. You could get hurt because of me." "Let it come," Lucas said, his voice steady and sure. "Whatever is chasing you, whatever danger you fear, let it come. I will stand between you and it. I will protect you, Grace, and I will help you fight for the truth. But I will not walk away from you. I will not let you face this alone anymore." In that moment, Grace made a choice. She had been running for so long, existing in the shadows and denying herself any connection or comfort. But here was a man who looked at her broken pieces and did not flinch, who offered not just protection, but partnership, who saw her and chose to stay. So instead of running, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring 3 years of loneliness and longing into that single touch. Lucas responded immediately, pulling her closer and deepening the kiss with a tenderness that made Grace's knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "I am taking that as a yes to courting you properly." "Yes," Grace breathed, allowing herself to hope for the first time since that terrible night in Denver. "Yes, Lucas, but you need to know what you are agreeing to. If Marcus finds me, when Marcus finds you," Lucas corrected, "because men like that do not give up easily. But when he does, we will face him together. We will tell the truth, and we will fight, and we will not let him take away the life you deserve to live. You have my word on that." They walked back to the boarding house, hand in hand, and for the first time in years, Grace felt the weight on her shoulders lighten just slightly. She knew the danger had not passed, that Marcus Devlin was still out there somewhere hunting her, but she was no longer facing that threat alone. Lucas meant what he said. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in the protective way he positioned himself between her and the darkened streets, sense it in the firm grip of his hand around hers. Over the following months, Grace and Lucas's courtship deepened into something beautiful and real. He courted her with old-fashioned propriety, asking Mrs. Henderson's permission to take Grace on chaperoned outings and treating her with a respect that healed something damaged inside her. They attended church socials together, went on picnics in the foothills, and spent long evenings on the boarding house porch talking about everything and nothing, while Mrs. Henderson sat nearby with her knitting, beaming at them like a proud mother. Lucas told the ranch foreman about Grace's situation, and the older man, a grizzled cowboy named Bill Thornton, who had no love for wealthy men who abused their power, offered his support. "If this Devlin character shows up looking for trouble," Bill said, "he will find the whole Double Creek crew standing against him. We take care of our own, and you are one of us now, Preston." Grace began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build a real life in Ely. She started using her full name again, stopped jumping at every shadow, and allowed herself to imagine a future with Lucas that included marriage and children and all the normal things she had thought lost to her forever. Lucas spoke of buying land and starting his own ranch, of building a house where they could grow old together, and Grace let herself dream along with him. But the past, as Grace had always known, had a way of refusing to stay buried. It was a cold November morning when Marcus Devlin rode into Ely with 3 hired guns at his back. Grace saw them from the boarding house window, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. Marcus looked older than she remembered, his handsome face hardened by bitterness and obsession, his expensive clothes out of place in the dusty mining town. He reined in his horse in front of the sheriff's office, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that her time had run out. Lucas was at the ranch, 10 miles away and unreachable. Grace's first instinct was to run, to grab what few possessions she owned and disappear into the desert before Marcus could find her. But running would only delay the inevitable, and worse, it would mean leaving Lucas behind, breaking both their hearts and proving that she had no faith in his promise to stand with her. So instead, Grace squared her shoulders, removed her apron, and walked out the front door of the boarding house with her head held high. If Marcus Devlin wanted to find her, she would not make him hunt through town, asking questions and potentially bringing harm to innocent people. She would face him directly and accept whatever consequences came, but she would do it on her own terms. She was halfway to the sheriff's office when Marcus spotted her. His eyes lit with savage triumph, and he dismounted quickly, striding toward her, with his men following close behind. Grace stopped walking and waited, her hands trembling, but her voice steady when she spoke. "Marcus," she said, proud that she did not sound as terrified as she felt, "I see you finally found me." "Grace Keller," Marcus said, his voice dripping with venom. 3 years I have been looking for you. 3 years of hiring investigators and following cold trails. But I never stopped, because I made a promise to my brother's memory that I would see justice done." "Justice," Grace repeated bitterly. "Your brother attacked me. He tried to rape me, Marcus. I defended myself. That is not murder. You killed him, Marcus snarled, close enough now that she could see the madness in his eyes. You took my brother from me, and you will hang for it. Sheriff Morrison, he called out as the lawman emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. I am here to report a wanted murderer in your town. This woman killed my brother in Denver 3 years ago and fled before she could face trial. Sheriff Morrison was a fair man in his 50s, with gray streaking his beard and a no-nonsense attitude that had kept Eli relatively peaceful, despite being a mining town. He looked between Marcus and Grace with cautious assessment. That is a serious accusation, Mr. Devlin. Do you have proof of these charges? I have an arrest warrant issued in Denver, Marcus said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. And I have my own testimony as witness to the aftermath of her crime. The sheriff took the document and read it carefully, while Grace's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She knew the warrant would be legal, that Marcus had the connections to make sure all the paperwork was in order. She was going to be arrested, possibly hanged, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The warrant appears legitimate, Sheriff Morrison said slowly. Miss Keller, I am going to have to take you into custody until this matter can be sorted out. You have the right to send for a lawyer. No. The word rang out across the street, and Grace turned to see Lucas riding hard down Main Street, his horse kicking up clouds of dust. He must have seen Marcus and his men riding past the ranch, must have realized what was happening, and come as fast as his horse could carry him. He dismounted before the animal had fully stopped and strode directly to Grace's side, positioning himself between her and Marcus exactly as he had promised. Lucas Preston, he said, extending his hand to the sheriff. I work at Double Creek Ranch, and I am courting Miss Keller. Whatever is happening here, she has the right to legal representation and a fair hearing before anyone takes her anywhere. Who the hell are you? Marcus demanded, his face flushing with anger. This does not concern you, Cowboy. Step aside before you find yourself facing charges for interfering with justice. Justice, Lucas said, his voice deadly calm in a way that made the temperature seem to drop. You keep using that word, but I do not think you know what it means. Grace told me everything about that night, Devlin. Your brother attacked her. He tried to force himself on her. She defended her life, which is not murder under any law, I know. You have only her word for that, Marcus shot back. The word of a killer who ran rather than face judgment. She ran because you threatened her, Lucas countered. She ran because she was a young woman alone with no resources facing a wealthy family that could buy whatever verdict they wanted. That is not guilt, Devlin. That is fear. Sheriff Morrison held up his hands. Everyone calm down. Preston, you make a fair point about legal representation. And, Mr. Devlin, I will need more than just your word about what happened that night. Were there other witnesses? Marcus hesitated, and Grace saw the flicker of uncertainty cross his face. The crime scene spoke for itself. My brother was dead on her floor, killed by her hand. But there were no witnesses to what preceded his death, the sheriff pressed. No one who saw what actually happened in that room. She killed him, Marcus insisted, his voice rising. That is not in dispute. She admitted it then, and I heard her admit it again just now. In self-defense, Lucas said firmly. Sheriff, I request that you allow Miss Keller to remain free on her own recognizance while we arrange for proper legal counsel and a fair hearing. She has been living peacefully in Ely for months now, working honestly and causing no trouble. She is not a flight risk. She ran before, Marcus interjected. What is to stop her from running again? I am, Lucas said simply. I vouch for her, and so does Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house, and so does Bill Thornton at Double Creek Ranch. We will guarantee her presence at any hearing or trial. Sheriff Morrison rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Grace could see him weighing the options, considering the legal complexities and the political realities of a case involving a wealthy Denver family. Finally, he said, Miss Keller, I am going to ask you directly. Did you kill Tyler Devlin? Yes, Grace said clearly, her voice not wavering. I killed him because he broke into my room, attacked me, and tried to rape me. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could reach, and I fought for my life. When he died, I panicked and ran because his brother was shouting that he would see me hang. I was wrong to run, I know that now, but I was terrified and alone. I am not running anymore. If I have to stand trial to clear my name, then that is what I will do. But I wanted understood that what I did was self-defense, not murder. The sheriff nodded slowly. I believe you, Miss Keller. I have been a lawman for 20 years, and I know the difference between a criminal and a victim. However, I also cannot ignore a legal warrant. Here is what I'm going to do. I will hold you here in Ely while I send telegrams to Denver requesting full information about this case, including any evidence or witness statements that were collected. In the meantime, you will remain free, but you must check in with my office every morning. Lucas Preston, since you have vouched for her, you will be responsible for making sure she complies. Mr. Devlin, you are welcome to remain in town, but I will not tolerate any harassment or vigilante action. This matter will be handled through proper legal channels. Are we all clear? Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but the sheriff's stern expression and the growing crowd of townspeople gathering to watch the confrontation made him reconsider. I will stay, he said through gritted teeth. But if she runs, Sheriff, I will hold you personally responsible. Noted, Sheriff Morrison said dryly. Now, everyone disperse. We have had enough excitement for one morning. Lucas immediately took Grace's arm and guided her away from the crowd, back toward the boarding house. She was shaking so hard she could barely walk, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation now draining away and leaving her weak and terrified. Lucas seemed to sense this because he swept her up into his arms and carried her the rest of the way, not caring who saw or what they might think. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, her face pale with worry. I saw what happened from the window. Sweet Jesus, Grace, are you all right? She will be, Lucas said, carrying Grace through to the small parlor and settling her on the sofa. Mrs. Henderson, could you make some strong tea and maybe ask if Doc Warren can come by? Grace is in shock. While Mrs. Henderson bustled away to put the kettle on, Lucas knelt beside the sofa and took both of Grace's hands in his. Look at me, he said gently. Grace, look at me. She focused on his storm gray eyes, using them as an anchor against the panic threatening to overwhelm her. He found me, she whispered. After all this time, Marcus found me. Yes, he did, Lucas agreed. But you did not run. You stood your ground and you told the truth, and Sheriff Morrison believed you. That is important, Grace. The sheriff is on your side. The warrant is legal, Grace said, her voice cracking. Marcus has always been clever about using the law to his advantage. Even if the sheriff believes me, a judge in Denver might not. I could hang Lucas. I could actually hang for defending myself. That is not going to happen, Lucas said fiercely. I promised you that I would stand between you and whatever was chasing you, and I meant it. We are going to fight this. Grace, we are going to get lawyers and witnesses, and we are going to prove that what you did was self-defense, and we are going to do it together. Over the following days, Lucas proved true to his word. He used his own savings to hire a lawyer from Carson City, a sharp-minded woman named Rebecca Thornton, who had built a reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning them through meticulous preparation and passionate advocacy. Rebecca arrived in Ely 4 days after Marcus and immediately set to work building Grace's defense. She interviewed Grace at length, taking detailed notes about the night Tyler Devlin died and the events leading up to it. She sent telegrams to Denver requesting all available evidence and witness statements. She even tracked down Grace's former employer at the dress shop, a kind woman named Mrs. Yates, who confirmed that Tyler Devlin had been pursuing Grace aggressively and that Grace had expressed fear of him in the weeks before his death. Meanwhile, Lucas organized support from the community. He spoke to everyone Grace had interacted with in Ely, gathering character witnesses who could testify to her good nature and honest work ethic. He convinced Bill Thornton to write a letter attesting to Grace's integrity, and he got Mrs. Henderson to provide a statement about Grace's employment history and peaceful conduct. Marcus Devlin did not sit idle during this time. He hired his own lawyer and used his considerable wealth to pressure the sheriff and intimidate potential witnesses. He made it known that anyone who testified on Grace's behalf would be making an enemy of the Devlin family, and in a small town like Ely, that kind of threat carried weight. Several people who had initially agreed to speak for Grace suddenly became unavailable or reluctant to get involved, but Lucas refused to be intimidated. When Marcus confronted him outside the saloon one evening, backed by his hired guns, Lucas stood his ground despite being outnumbered. You can threaten me all you want, Devlin, he said calmly. It will not change the truth of what your brother did, or the fact that Grace was defending herself. My brother was a good man, Marcus said, his voice shaking with anger and what might have been genuine grief beneath the rage. He would never have hurt anyone. Then you did not know him as well as you thought, Lucas replied, not without sympathy. I am sorry for your loss, Devlin. Truly I am. But your brother made a terrible choice that night, and Grace should not have to pay for his actions with her life. The trial was set for early December, to be held in Ely, with a circuit judge brought in from Carson City to ensure impartiality. Rebecca worked tirelessly to prepare Grace's defense, coaching her on testimony and gathering evidence to support her version of events. The response from Denver had been less helpful than hoped. The investigation had been cursory at best, with most of the focus on finding Grace rather than determining what actually happened in that room. On the morning of the trial, Grace dressed in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Lucas had bought for her, because her own clothes were too worn for court. Her hands would not stop shaking as she tried to pin up her hair, and finally Lucas gently took the pins from her and did it himself, his fingers steady and sure, even though she knew he must be as nervous as she was. Whatever happens today, he said softly, meeting her eyes in the mirror, I want you to know that I love you, Grace Keller. I love your strength and your courage and your refusal to give up even when everything seems impossible. And when this is over, when we have won and cleared your name, I am going to marry you properly with the whole town watching. That is a promise. Grace turned and wrapped her arms around him, holding on tight to the one solid thing in her crumbling world. I love you too, she whispered against his chest, and I am sorry for bringing all this trouble into your life. You brought light into my life, Lucas corrected, pulling back to kiss her forehead. Everything else is just details we have to work through. Now come on, Rebecca is waiting, and we have a fight to win. The courtroom was packed when they arrived, with seemingly everyone in Ely turning out to watch the proceedings. Grace saw Mrs. Henderson in the front row, offering an encouraging smile. Bill Thornton and several of the Double Creek ranch hands filled the seats behind her, a silent show of support. On the other side of the room, Marcus Devlin sat with his expensive lawyer and his hired guns, his face a mask of cold fury. Judge Harold Mitchell was a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He called the court to order and listened impassively as Marcus's lawyer, a slick-talking man named Reginald Hunt, laid out the prosecution's case. Hunt painted Grace as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered Tyler Devlin in a fit of rage and then fled justice like the coward she was. The facts are simple, Your Honor, Hunt said, pacing before the bench. Tyler Devlin visited Miss Keller's residence on the evening of September 15th, 1875. Later that night, he was found dead on her floor, stabbed in the neck with her own sewing scissors. Miss Keller disappeared immediately and remained at large for 3 years, despite extensive efforts to locate her. This is not the behavior of an innocent woman defending herself. This is the behavior of a guilty woman fleeing the consequences of her actions. Rebecca stood to present the defense, and Grace was struck again by the lawyer's commanding presence and articulate speech. Your Honor, the facts as Mr. Hunt presents them are accurate but incomplete. Yes, Tyler Devlin died in Miss Keller's room. Yes, she left Denver that same night. But what Mr. Hunt conveniently omits is the context that explains both of those facts. Tyler Devlin did not simply visit Miss Keller's residence. He forced entry into her locked room while she slept. He attacked her. He attempted to rape her. And Miss Keller, in fear for her life and her virtue, defended herself with the only weapon at hand. Hunt objected immediately. There is no evidence to support this convenient narrative of self-defense. Only the defendant's word against that of a dead man who cannot defend himself. Then let us examine the evidence more closely, Rebecca countered. She pulled out a sheaf of papers and approached the bench. Your Honor, I have here a statement from Mrs. Eleanor Yates, Miss Keller's employer at the time of the incident. Mrs. Yates states that in the weeks leading up to Tyler Devlin's death, Miss Keller expressed concern about his unwanted advances. He would not accept her rejections of his romantic overtures. He began appearing at her workplace uninvited. He made her uncomfortable to the point that Mrs. Yates had to ask him to stop visiting the shop. Hearsay, Hunt said dismissively, and hardly proof of anything except that Miss Keller misinterpreted normal courtship as harassment. I also have the coroner's report from Denver, Rebecca continued undeterred, which Mr. Hunt somehow neglected to mention. The report notes that Miss Keller had significant bruising around her throat, consistent with attempted strangulation. She also had defensive wounds on her hands and arms. The physical evidence supports her account of a violent struggle. Grace watched Judge Mitchell lean forward with interest, studying the documents Rebecca presented. Hope flickered in her chest, fragile as candlelight in wind. "Furthermore," Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength, "I have affidavits from multiple residents of Ely, Nevada, attesting to Miss Keller's good character during the 8 months she has resided here. She has been a model citizen, working honestly and causing no trouble. This is not the profile of a dangerous criminal. This is a young woman who made a terrible choice to run. Yes, but who did so out of fear for her life after the victim's brother, Mr. Marcus Devlin, explicitly threatened her before she could tell her side of the story to authorities." Marcus leaped to his feet. "That is a lie. I never threatened her." "Mr. Devlin, sit down," Judge Mitchell said sharply. "You will have your chance to testify. Continue, Miss Thornton." Rebecca nodded. "Your Honor, I would like to call Miss Grace Keller to the stand to tell her story in her own words." Grace's legs felt like water as she stood and made her way to the witness chair. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat down and forced herself to meet the judge's eyes. Lucas sat directly in her line of sight, his presence a steadying force. Rebecca began with gentle questions about Grace's background, her work at the dress shop, her initial interactions with Tyler Devlin. Grace answered honestly, describing how Tyler had seemed charming at first, bringing flowers and compliments, but how his attention had quickly turned possessive and frightening when she made it clear she was not interested in courtship. "Tell the court about the night Tyler Devlin died," Rebecca said softly. Grace took a deep breath and let the memories surface, painful as reopening an old wound. "I had worked late that evening, finishing a wedding dress for a customer. I returned to my room above the shop around 10 o'clock. I locked the door as I always did and prepared for bed. I was nearly asleep when I heard someone at my door. Before I could react, the door burst open. Tyler had picked the lock." She described the attack in clinical detail, forcing emotion aside so she could get through the testimony. Tyler's drunken rage, his hands around her throat, her desperate struggle to breathe, the moment she managed to grab the scissors from her work table and drive them into his neck. The blood, the terrible gurgling sound he made, the way he collapsed and did not move again. "I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could not believe what had happened. I knew I should run for the sheriff, that I should report what Tyler had done and how I defended myself. But then Marcus Devlin arrived. He must have been with Tyler earlier in the evening, must have come looking for him. He saw his brother's body, and he looked at me with such hatred. He said I would hang for this, that he would make sure of it, that his family would never let me get away with murdering his brother. So I ran. I was terrified and alone, and I ran." "Why did you not turn yourself in later, when you had time to think more clearly?" Rebecca asked. "Because Marcus is wealthy and connected," Grace said honestly. "Because I was nobody, just a seamstress with no family and no resources. Because I knew how these things go, how women are rarely believed when they speak of men's violence. I thought running was my only chance at survival." Hunt took his turn at cross-examination, trying to poke holes in Grace's story and paint her as a liar. But Grace remained calm and consistent, and when Hunt pushed too hard, suggesting that she had perhaps led Tyler on and then regretted it, Lucas stood up from his seat so abruptly that the judge had to call for order. "Sit down, Mr. Preston," Judge Mitchell said, but not without a hint of sympathy in his stern voice. "I understand your feelings, but you must allow the proceedings to continue without disruption." Marcus testified next, and his testimony was predictably bitter and accusatory. But under Rebecca's cross-examination, cracks began to show. He admitted that he had arrived at Grace's room within minutes of his brother's death, that he had made statements about seeing her punished, that in his rage and grief, he had perhaps said things that could have been interpreted as threats. "Did you ever consider," Rebecca asked pointedly, "that your brother might have done exactly what Miss Keller claims? That he might have attacked her and that she defended herself?" "Never," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Tyler would not have done that. Or perhaps you did not want to believe he could do that," Rebecca suggested gently. "Perhaps it was easier to blame Miss Keller than to accept that your brother was capable of violence." The trial lasted 3 days in total. Rebecca called character witnesses who testified to Grace's good nature and honest conduct. Mrs. Yates traveled all the way from Denver to testify about Tyler Devlin's increasingly aggressive behavior toward Grace. The coroner who had examined both bodies provided expert testimony about the wounds on Grace's neck and arms that supported her claim of a violent struggle. Hunt tried his best to discredit every witness and discount every piece of evidence, but the picture that emerged was clear. Grace had been defending herself against a violent attack, and she had run not because she was guilty, but because she had every reason to believe she would not receive justice through proper channels. On the fourth morning, Judge Mitchell delivered his verdict. The courtroom was silent as death as he reviewed his notes and considered his words. Finally, he looked up and fixed his gaze on Grace. "Miss Keller, you have been charged with murder in the death of Tyler Devlin. The court has heard testimony from multiple witnesses and reviewed all available evidence. While I cannot condone your decision to flee rather than face justice through proper channels, I understand the circumstances that led to that choice. Based on the evidence presented, including the testimony of Mrs. Yates regarding Tyler Devlin's escalating behavior, the coroner's report documenting your injuries consistent with strangulation and defensive wounds, and your own credible testimony about the events of that night, I find that you acted in self-defense against an unprovoked and violent attack." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but did not dare move or make a sound. "Therefore," Judge Mitchell continued, "this court finds you not guilty of murder. The charges are dismissed, and you are free to go. However, I am issuing a formal reprimand for fleeing from authorities and strongly advise that, should you ever find yourself in such a situation again, you trust in the legal system to provide justice. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel striking was drowned out by the eruption of cheers from Grace's supporters. Lucas was at her side instantly, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tight she could barely breathe. But she did not care because she was free. She was finally free. Marcus Devlin stormed out of the courtroom without looking back, his face twisted with fury and grief. Grace felt a pang of sympathy for him, despite everything. He had lost his brother and spent 3 years consumed by the need for revenge, only to discover that his brother had brought about his own death through his terrible actions. That was a bitter truth to swallow. Rebecca shook Grace's hand and accepted her tearful thanks with a warm smile. "You were very brave," the lawyer said, "both in that room 3 years ago and in this courtroom today. I wish you all the happiness you deserve, Miss Keller." The town of Ely celebrated Grace's acquittal with genuine joy. Mrs. Henderson threw an impromptu party at the boarding house, and it seemed like half the town showed up to congratulate Grace and express their support. Grace moved through the celebration in a daze, still not quite believing that the nightmare was finally over. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, Lucas took Grace's hand and led her out to the porch where they could be alone beneath the vast Nevada sky. The stars were brilliant and countless, the air crisp with the promise of winter. "I have something to ask you," Lucas said, dropping to one knee right there on the weathered boards. He pulled a simple gold ring from his pocket, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Grace Keller, you are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You have been through hell and come out the other side, and I would be honored to spend the rest of my life standing beside you through whatever comes next. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Grace said through happy tears, not hesitating for even a moment. "Yes, Lucas Preston. I will absolutely marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her properly, the kind of kiss that promised forever and meant it. When they finally broke apart, Grace laughed with pure joy, a sound she had not made in years. They were married 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the Ely church, with Mrs. Henderson standing as Grace's witness, and Bill Thornton serving as Lucas's best man. The whole town turned out to celebrate, and even Sheriff Morrison attended with his wife, offering his congratulations and his apologies for the rough road Grace had traveled to reach this happy moment. Lucas and Grace moved into a small house on the edge of town, while Lucas saved money to buy the land he dreamed of. Grace continued working at the boarding house until she discovered she was pregnant the following spring, at which point Mrs. Henderson insisted she stop hauling heavy laundry and focus on preparing for the baby. Their first child, a son they named James after Lucas's father, was born in October 1879 during the first snowfall of the season. Lucas held his son with such tender wonder that Grace fell in love with him all over again, seeing the man he would be as a father. Life settled into a rhythm of simple contentment. Lucas eventually saved enough to buy 300 acres north of town, where he built a ranch house with his own hands, aided by friends from Double Creek and townspeople who had come to care for the young couple. Grace planted a garden and filled the house with love and laughter, and slowly, the shadows of her past faded into distant memory. They had 2 more children over the following years, a daughter named Elizabeth in 1881 and another son named Robert in 1883. Lucas proved to be the father Grace had always hoped for her children, patient and kind and present in their lives in ways her own father had been before illness claimed him. Marcus Devlin, Grace learned through letters from Rebecca Thornton, had eventually made peace with his brother's death. He married a woman from San Francisco and moved west, leaving Denver and its bitter memories behind. Grace felt no ill will toward him. She understood grief and how it could twist a person into someone they never meant to become. She hoped he found happiness in his new life. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Grace back to the creek where they had first met. It was early morning, just like that first day, and the rising sun painted everything in shades of gold and rose. "Do you remember what I told you that night in the desert?" Lucas asked, holding both her hands in his. "When you told me about your past and your fear that it would catch up to you?" "You said let it come," Grace replied softly. "You said you would stand between me and it." "I meant every word," Lucas said, "and I want you to know that I would make the same choice again in a heartbeat. You were worth fighting for then, and you are worth fighting for now, and you will be worth fighting for every day for the rest of our lives." Grace kissed her husband there by the creek where their story began, grateful beyond words for the second chance she had been given. The past had indeed caught up to her, but instead of destroying her, it had led her to the man who taught her that running was not the answer, that standing and fighting with someone you loved beside you was always better than facing the darkness alone. They returned to the ranch where their children were waiting, where their life was waiting, where their future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. Grace had spent 3 years running from her past, but she would spend the rest of her life running toward the future she and Lucas were building together, one day at a time, one moment of love and courage at a time. Years passed in the peaceful rhythm of ranch life. James grew into a serious, hard-working boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to rope and ride and care for the cattle that now numbered in the hundreds. Elizabeth inherited her mother's gentle heart and her father's determination, refusing to be left behind when her brothers went exploring in the hills. Robert was the wild one, fearless and full of laughter, keeping his parents on their toes with his adventurous spirit. Lucas expanded the ranch steadily, never overreaching, but always planning for the future. He hired on a few hands to help with the work, including a young man named Sam, who had drifted into Ely looking for honest employment and a fresh start, not unlike Lucas himself years earlier. Grace saw her husband's kindness reflected in how he treated his workers, paying fair wages and treating everyone with respect regardless of their circumstances. Grace became known throughout Ely for her kindness and her willingness to help others. She took in sewing work to earn extra money for the family, and she never turned away anyone who came to her door hungry or in need. She remembered too well what it felt like to be desperate and alone, and she was determined to offer the help she once needed to anyone who required it. Mrs. Henderson, growing elderly but still sharp as ever, sold the boarding house in 1886 and moved into a small cottage on Lucas and Grace's property. She became a grandmother figure to the Preston children, telling them stories of the old days and teaching them skills their parents did not have time to impart. When she passed peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1889, the whole family mourned her deeply, and Grace named her 4th child, a daughter born that spring, Margaret, in honor of the woman who had given her a chance when she most needed it. The Preston Ranch became one of the most respected operations in the region, known for quality cattle and honest dealing. Lucas served on the town council for several years, using his position to advocate for fair treatment of workers and proper law enforcement. He never forgot the importance of standing up for people who could not stand up for themselves, a lesson reinforced by his own experience defending Grace. On a warm summer evening in 1892, 17 years after that terrible night in Denver, Grace and Lucas sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Elizabeth, now 11, was teaching young Margaret how to braid wildflowers into a crown. James, at 13, was showing Robert and his younger sister how to properly throw a rope. The scene was so peaceful, so perfect, that Grace had to pause and simply appreciate the life they had built. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, reaching over to take her hand as he always did. "How lucky I am," Grace said honestly. "How close I came to losing everything, and how you saved me." "We saved each other," Lucas corrected gently. "I was drifting before I met you, Grace, working ranch to ranch with no real purpose or direction. You gave me something to fight for, something to build toward. You made me want to be better than I was." "You were already good," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "You just needed someone to see it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children and counting their blessings. Finally, Lucas spoke again. "I heard some news in town today. Marcus Devlin passed away last month in San Francisco. Heart failure, apparently." Grace absorbed this information quietly. She had not thought about Marcus in years, had released the anger and fear she once felt toward him. "I hope he found peace," she said finally. "I hope he was happy in the end." "That is very generous of you," Lucas observed. "He lost someone he loved," Grace said. "However misguided his response was, I understand that kind of pain, and holding on to bitterness serves no purpose. Our life is too good to waste energy on old grudges." Lucas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Have I mentioned lately that I love you?" "Not in at least an hour," Grace teased. "I was beginning to wonder." "I love you, Grace Preston," Lucas said, his voice carrying the same certainty it had that night in the desert when he first declared his feelings. "I loved you then, I love you now, and I will love you until my last breath, and probably beyond." "And I love you," Grace replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for standing between me and the darkness. Thank you for teaching me that I did not have to run anymore." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had killed a man, fled across multiple territories, lived in fear for 3 years, and nearly lost everything to the demons of her past. But she had also found love, built a family, created a home, and discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The past had indeed chased her, but when it finally caught up, she had not faced it alone. Lucas had stood between her and it, exactly as he promised, and together they had fought for the truth and won. That victory had given them this life, these children, these peaceful evenings filled with love and laughter. The Preston children eventually grew and started families of their own. James took over the ranch when Lucas grew too old to manage it alone, running it with the same integrity and kindness his father had modeled. Elizabeth married a doctor and moved to Reno, where she opened a clinic that served both wealthy and poor patients without discrimination. Robert became a lawyer, inspired by Rebecca Thornton's defense of his mother, and spent his career defending people who could not afford proper legal representation. Margaret, the youngest, stayed close to home, teaching school in Ely and caring for her aging parents. Lucas and Grace grew old together on the ranch they had built, watching their grandchildren play in the same yard where their own children had played. They sat on that same porch every evening, holding hands and counting blessings, and the love between them never dimmed or faded, but only grew deeper and more comfortable with each passing year. When Lucas passed away in the spring of 1910 at the age of 63, he died peacefully in his sleep, with Grace holding his hand. She mourned him deeply but not desperately, secure in the knowledge that they had lived a full life together and loved each other well. She knew he would want her to continue living, to continue finding joy in their children and grandchildren, to continue being the strong, resilient woman he had fallen in love with beside a creek in Nevada all those years ago. Grace lived another 8 years, surrounded by family and friends, respected and loved by everyone who knew her. She spent her final years telling stories to her grandchildren about the Wild West of her youth, about a time when life was harder but somehow simpler, when love meant standing together against whatever darkness threatened. On a cold November morning in 1918, Grace Keller Preston passed away quietly at the age of 62, with her children and grandchildren gathered around her bed. Her last words were of Lucas, calling his name with a smile on her face, as if seeing him waiting for her on the other side of whatever came next. They buried her next to Lucas on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a headstone that read, "Grace Keller Preston, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She ran until she found someone worth standing still for." The Preston family continued to thrive for generations, each one carrying forward the lessons Lucas and Grace had taught. through their lives and their love. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand and fight despite it. That love meant showing up for each other, especially in the darkest moments, that everyone deserved a second chance and someone willing to fight for them. And in the quiet cemetery on the hill overlooking the Nevada desert, two simple headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of a cowboy who kept his promises and a woman who learned to stop running. Their story lived on in the memories of their descendants, a testament to the transformative power of love and the importance of standing together against whatever darkness life brings. The ranch they built still operated more than a century later, passed down through the Preston family from generation to generation. The house Lucas built with his own hands had been expanded and modernized, but the original structure remained at its heart, a reminder of where it all began. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right across the Nevada desert, the current residents swore they could feel the presence of Lucas and Grace, still watching over the land they loved and the family they created, still holding hands and counting blessings, still together in whatever comes after this life ends. Their story was one of redemption and courage, of fear overcome and love triumphant, of a woman who ran until she found a man worth standing still for, and a cowboy who meant what he said when he promised to stand between her and whatever darkness chased her. It was a love story forged in hardship and sealed in trust, and it endured long after both of them had gone, inspiring everyone who heard it to be a little braver, a little kinder, and a little more willing to stand up for the people they loved. In the end, that was the legacy Lucas and Grace left behind. Not just the ranch or the family or the material success, but the example of what it meant to truly love someone, to see them at their worst and choose to stay, to stand with them against impossible odds, to believe in them when they could not believe in themselves, to offer protection without demanding control, support without requiring submission, partnership built on respect and trust rather than possession and fear. Grace had feared her past would chase her forever, but Lucas had said, "Let it come. I will stand between you and it." And he had meant every word. That promise, kept faithfully across decades of marriage, became the foundation of everything good in their lives. It was the promise their children learned to make and keep in their own relationships, the promise their grandchildren carried forward into new generations, the promise that defined what it meant to be a Preston, to stand for those who could not stand alone, to fight for justice and truth, to love without reservation or retreat. And so, the story of Grace Keller, who killed a man in self-defense and ran for 3 years before finding redemption in a dusty Nevada mining town, and Lucas Preston, the cowboy who loved her enough to stand between her and the darkness, became part of the legend of the American West. Not the legend of gunfights and gold rushes, but the quieter, deeper legend of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of love that conquered fear, of courage that looked like simply choosing to stay when running would have been easier. Their story proved that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stop running and face whatever was chasing them, especially when they had someone they trusted standing beside them. It proved that the past did not have to define the future, that mistakes and tragedies could be overcome with truth and determination and love. It proved that justice, real justice, was possible even when the odds seemed impossibly stacked, if people were willing to fight for it. Most of all, their story proved that love, real and lasting love, was worth every risk, every fight, every moment of fear and uncertainty. Because at the end of all the struggle and hardship, what remained was the simple truth that they had found each other, chosen each other, and built a life together that honored both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. They had loved each other well and completely, and that love had created ripples that extended far beyond their own lives into the lives of everyone they touched. As the sun set over the Nevada desert one last time on this telling of their tale, the message remained clear. Love was not about grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though those had their place. Real love was about showing up day after day, year after year, keeping promises even when it was difficult, standing together against whatever came, and choosing each other over and over again until that choice became as natural as breathing. Grace and Lucas had done that. They had loved each other through fear and triumph, through hardship and plenty, through the raising of children and the quiet of old age. They had built something lasting and true, and though their bodies were long since dust, their love story lived on, inspiring others to be brave enough to stand still, to trust enough to be vulnerable, to love enough to fight for each other no matter what darkness threatened. That was their gift to the world, and it was a gift that would never stop giving as long as someone, somewhere, needed to hear that running was not the only option, that redemption was possible, and that love, real love, was always worth the risk of standing and fighting for.